Somewhere above you right now, a crow may already know your face, your daily route, and whether you are someone worth trusting or someone worth avoiding. And by the time this video ends, you will understand why a team of scientists who trained an artificial intelligence system on crow calls came away saying they had genuinely underestimated these birds. Before we go further, hit subscribe now, because what you are about to hear comes directly from real recordings, peer-reviewed research, and documented. For most of human history, crows were treated as background noise. A harsh call here, a flock scattering there, nothing anyone paid much attention to. But when researchers decided to take those calls seriously and feed enormous volumes of recorded crow vocalizations into a machine learning system, the outcome was nothing like what anyone expected walking into the project. The original plan was simple. Researchers wanted to know whether an algorithm could sort thousands of recorded calls into broad categories such as alarm calls, food-related calls, and everything else. It sounded like a fairly ordinary classification exercise, the kind of project that produces a modest paper and gets forgotten within a year. That is not what happened. The recordings came from cities, farmland forests, and university campuses, collected over months using directional microphones placed near roosting sites and known feeding areas. Thousands of hours of raw audio were cleaned, segmented, and fed into a neural network trained specifically to detect patterns in sound. At first, the system behaved exactly as predicted. Certain calls clustered tightly around food discovery, others clustered around predator alerts, and a large portion simply landed in a vague category of general chatter. Then the researchers noticed something strange sitting inside that so-called general chatter. A specific cluster of calls kept repeating in an oddly consistent order, yet none of those calls matched the patterns tied to food or danger. They did not fit anywhere. At first, the team assumed they had made an error somewhere in their data pipeline. Mislabeled files, a corrupted batch, perhaps a microphone picking up interference. They went back through the raw recordings by hand, cross-checked timestamps, and reran the model with a cleaned dataset. The pattern held. Whatever this cluster of calls represented, it was not noise, and it was not a labeling mistake. It was structure, and it was consistent across recordings taken from birds that had never encountered each other. To understand why that mattered so much, think about how word order works in a normal sentence. The dog chased the ball makes sense. Swap the words around into the ball, chase the dog, and the meaning flips entirely, even though every individual word stayed exactly the same. That difference comes down to syntax, the order in which pieces of language are arranged. The AI system found something eerily similar buried inside these unexplained crow calls. Specific short calls consistently appeared in a fixed sequence. One type of call followed reliably by a second and occasionally a third. And whenever that order shifted even slightly, the apparent context attached to the recording shifted along with it. This was not a bird making one sound over and over. This looked like the early skeleton of grammar. One case that stood out to researchers involved a groundskeeper who wore a bright yellow safety vest while doing maintenance. Worked near a research campus. Every time he appeared, a specific crow perched nearby produced one particular call, a call the AI had never linked to any other recorded event in the entire dataset. Weeks later, the same groundskeeper returned and the same crow produced the identical distinctive call again. On its own, that could simply mean one bird remembered one man. But the detail that genuinely surprised the team came a short time after that, when an entirely different crow, recorded in a separate part of the same park, produced that exact same call the moment the groundskeeper walked into view, despite there being no clear way that second. Bird had personally encountered him before. Somehow, specific identifying information about one human appeared to have moved. From one crow to another, something that functions almost like a name had apparently been shared across a small local network of researchers, described this as one of the most significant findings buried inside the entire dataset. Because assigning a distinct, repeatable label to a specific individual and then having that label spread to other individuals who never personally met the subject is a genuinely rare behavior across the animal kingdom. It suggests these birds are not simply reacting to a face. They may be storing that face under some form of internal tag and then passing that tag along through their social circle. In their world, you stop being an anonymous stranger the moment you cross paths with the wrong crow at the wrong time. The deeper the researchers dug, the stranger things became. Certain vocal sequences in the recordings consistently began before an expected event had actually taken place. In practical terms, that meant crows near a known feeding or nesting site would sometimes begin a very specific, structured exchange of calls shortly before a particular person arrived, on a route they walked, regularly, almost as if the birds were coordinating a response ahead of time rather than simply reacting once someone showed up. Researchers began referring to this informally as a planning phase, and while that term invites plenty of debate, the underlying pattern was hard to dismiss. This was not random shouting. It followed the same basic order every time it occurred. Just as interesting was how differently crows appeared to treat different types of people. The recordings showed measurable differences between calls linked to someone who regularly left out food scraps versus calls linked to someone who had previously thrown something at a bird or disturbed a nest. The friendly interactions produced softer, shorter vocal patterns, while the hostile interactions produced sharper, louder calls that closely resembled established alarm signals. In other words, these birds did not appear to treat humans as one single undifferentiated category. They seemed to be actively sorting people based on remembered behavior and adjusting how they communicated about each person accordingly. If you have ever fed a crow a piece of bread and had it seem to remember you afterward, this research suggests that impression was not your imagination. This kind of individual recognition is not limited to a single research site either. Similar patterns have shown up in studies conducted in entirely different countries, using different crow species, different researchers, and completely separate equipment. That consistency matters, because it rules out the possibility that one unusually social group of birds in one specific park happened to develop an unusual habit. Instead, it points towards something closer to a shared trait running across the species as a whole, a general capacity for recognizing, categorizing, and remembering specific humans that simply had not been properly documented until recording and analysis technology became advanced enough to catch it happening. The AI system itself deserves a closer look because the way it approached this problem was not far removed from how researchers train systems to analyze human speech. Audio was broken down into extremely short segments, each one converted into a spectrogram, essentially a visual map of pitch, frequency, and duration over time. The model then searched for recurring shapes within those maps, treating each distinct shape roughly the way a language model treats a word. Over time, it began building something close to a working vocabulary of crow sounds, complete with rough estimates of how often certain sounds appeared next to each other, and under what circumstances. This approach, sometimes called unsupervised pattern discovery, is powerful precisely because researchers do not need to already know what they are looking for. The system finds the structure on its own, which is exactly what led it toward patterns nobody on the research team had originally set out to find. None of this makes much sense without understanding what is actually happening inside a crow's skull, because on paper, their brains should not be capable of anything like this. A crow's brain weighs a tiny fraction of a human brain, and for a long time, scientists assumed advanced reasoning required a cerebral cortex, the layered outer structure responsible for higher-order thinking in mammals. Birds simply do not have one. For decades, that absence was treated as proof that birds were incapable of sophisticated cognition. That assumption did not survive closer examination. What researchers eventually discovered is that bird brains rely on a completely different structure called the pallium, and while it looks nothing like a mammalian cortex from the outside, it is packed with an extraordinarily high density of neurons relative to its size. In practical terms, a crow's brain may be small, but it is remarkably efficient, cramming a surprising amount of processing power into a compact space. This is part of why some scientists have started referring to crows as feathered apes, since their observed problem-solving abilities increasingly resemble what you would expect from far larger primate brains. Evolution apparently found more than one route toward genuine intelligence, and crows landed on a version that looks nothing like ours on the surface while producing strikingly similar results underneath. If that still sounds like a stretch, a handful of well-documented experiments make the case considerably harder to dismiss. New Caledonian crows have been repeatedly observed constructing actual tools from scratch, carefully cutting and shaping leaves, from pandanus plants into hooked implements used to pull insects out of tight crevices and tree bark. This is not an accident of instinct. Researchers have watched younger crows observing older, more experienced birds performing this exact process, which strongly suggests the specific technique is taught rather than simply reinvented from scratch by every individual bird. Interestingly, different populations of these crows have been observed producing slightly different tool designs depending on the region they come from, almost like distinct manufacturing traditions passed down locally, which further reinforces the idea that this is learned cultural knowledge rather than a fixed instinctive behavior hardwired identically into every bird. Then there is the now well-known water displacement test, in which researchers placed a small piece of food floating just out of reach inside a narrow tube partly filled with water, alongside a pile of heavy stones and a pile of lightweight foam pieces nearby. If crow behavior came down to blind trial and error, you would expect a bird to grab whatever object happened to be closest. Instead, the crows tested repeatedly chose only the heavier stones, dropping them in one after another while ignoring the foam entirely, until the rising water carried the food within reach. That kind of selective behavior implies a working grasp of basic physical concepts like density and displacement, not random guessing, And the result has been repeated across multiple research groups with consistent outcomes, ruling out the possibility that one especially clever individual bird simply got lucky during a single trial. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of long-term memory comes from a study led by researcher John Marsluff, who wanted to test whether crows could recognize specific human faces over extended periods of time. To avoid becoming a permanent target himself, he wore a distinctive rubber mask while briefly capturing and releasing a small number of wild crows on a university campus. Unsurprisingly, the birds were not pleased and responded with loud alarm calls and aggressive dive bombing before eventually being released unharmed. The real experiment began afterward. When Marsluff returned to the same location wearing a completely different mask, the local crows showed little reaction. But the moment he put the original mask back on, even years later, the birds reacted immediately with alarm calls and aggressive swooping. Remarkably, the number of crows participating in this reaction grew over time, eventually including birds that had not even been born during the original encounter, strongly suggesting that this specific threat information had been passed down from one generation of crows to the next, rather than simply remembered by the original handful of birds involved. Beyond mask recognition, crows have also passed other tests originally designed to measure self-awareness and numerical understanding in far larger-brained animals. Some crow species have shown an ability to track quantities up to around 4 or 5 items without physically recounting them, choosing correctly between containers, holding different amounts of hidden food even after a short delay. Others have demonstrated an understanding of cause and effect chains involving multiple steps, such as pulling a string to release a weight, which in turn triggers a second mechanism needed to finally access a food reward, a sequence that requires planning several steps ahead rather than simply reacting to whatever is directly in front of them. None of these tasks resemble anything a crow would naturally encounter in the wild, which is precisely why researchers consider them useful. They test flexible reasoning rather than instinct, shaped by millions of years of repetition. Crows also appear to maintain something resembling their own basic social order. When one crow dies, nearby crows do not simply scatter, they often gather nearby and produce distinct vocalizations, a behavior researchers once assumed reflected grief, but now increasingly interpret as something closer to information gathering, almost like a group assessing exactly what killed their companion. So the same danger can be avoided in the future. Crow groups have also been observed enforcing a kind of internal discipline, with individuals that repeatedly steal food or behave aggressively toward others, sometimes being surrounded, scolded, and driven away by the rest of the group. And in scattered but well-documented cases, people who consistently feed local crows have reported finding small items left behind in return, shiny fragments, small pebbles, occasionally coins, suggesting something close to an informal system of reciprocity. All of this social behavior has become considerably easier to observe in recent decades, simply because crows have moved closer to us. Urban and suburban environments now support crow populations far denser than anything typically found in undisturbed wilderness, largely because cities offer a steady, predictable supply of food scraps, fewer natural predators, and a wide range of elevated structures perfectly suited to their preferred style of watching the world from above. That proximity means crows now spend an enormous amount of time observing human routines up close, day after day, which may be part of why their apparent understanding of individual humans has become sophisticated enough for researchers to measure it in the first place. In a very real sense, our own habit of building cities may have inadvertently created ideal conditions for these birds to study us in extraordinary detail. When researchers began comparing recordings collected from crow populations in different cities, they found something else unexpected: regional variation. Much like humans in different areas develop distinct accents, crow populations in separate locations produced calls with subtly different characteristics. But certain specific calls, particularly ones tied to a newly encountered danger, did not stay confined to their city of origin. Within a matter of months, the same distinctive call sometimes began appearing among crow populations in an entirely different region, among birds that had never personally encountered the original threat. Some researchers have informally described this as something close to an analog information network, a system of shared knowledge, moving from one population to another without a single wire or server involved anywhere in the process. For months, the research team kept feeding fresh recordings into their AI system, and it kept refining its understanding, growing, increasingly confident in the patterns it had identified. Then something shifted. The familiar structured sequences that had defined the data set up to that point began to change, replaced by a different, more repetitive rhythmic pattern the model struggled to classify. Confidence scores dropped sharply, and the system that had spent months producing clean, consistent output suddenly began generating far messier results. Researchers initially assumed this reflected a simple regional variation until they noticed the exact same shift appearing almost simultaneously across multiple, widely separated crow populations that had no obvious way of influencing each other directly. That detail is where the story takes its strangest turn. Some researchers have floated the idea, still unproven and openly debated within the field, that crows may have somehow picked up on the fact that they were being closely observed. Unfamiliar. Microphones placed in trees, researchers standing still for unusually long stretches, recording equipment appearing in locations it had never been before. Given everything already established about their ability to recognize individual humans, remember them for years, and share information about specific threats, it is not an unreasonable question to ask whether they might also notice unusual patterns of human behavior directed at them. Under this theory, the original communication pattern the AI had learned to interpret may have simply been an older, more open channel, and once suspicion set in, crow populations may have begun, shifting towards something considerably harder for an outside system to decode. If there is any truth to that idea, it would not mean crows had gone quiet. It would mean the meaningful part of their communication had simply moved somewhere researchers were no longer able to properly track. It is also worth remembering that crows are not the only members of their family showing this level of complexity. Ravens, magpies, and jays, all close relatives within the same broader corvid family, have separately demonstrated strikingly similar abilities in isolated studies, including tool use, delayed gratification, and apparent awareness of what other individuals can or cannot see during moments of hiding food. That pattern suggests whatever is happening inside a crow's skull is not some isolated evolutionary accident unique to one single species. It looks more like a shared trait running through an entire family of birds that split off from other bird lineages tens of millions of years ago and quietly developed one of the most capable brains in the animal kingdom, largely without anyone noticing until fairly recently. That raises a genuinely uncomfortable question about how many other animals living alongside us every single day might be running comparable systems of observation and memory, simply without the benefit of a research team feeding thousands of hours of recordings into a machine learning model to prove it. Crows happen to be the ones caught on record this time, partly because they are common, easy to observe in urban settings, and unusually tolerant of human presence. There's no obvious reason to assume they are the only ones capable of something like this. It simply took the right combination of patient researchers, thousands of hours of recorded audio, and a machine learning system willing to sit with the data long enough to notice what nobody else had thought to look for. Before you go, if stories exploring animal intelligence and the limits of what we actually understand interest you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what gets uncovered next. None of this required a shred of exaggeration to reach. Every claim in this video traces back to recorded audio, published research, or repeated experiments conducted across multiple independent teams, which is precisely what makes the overall picture so difficult to simply brush aside as internet folklore. Put everything together, and the picture that emerges is genuinely difficult to dismiss. Crows appear to recognize specific human faces, assign something functioning like names to individuals, share warnings across entire regions without ever meeting the humans involved, and possibly adjust their own communication once they suspect they are being studied. All of this from a brain a fraction of the size of our own, built on a structure that evolved along a completely separate path from anything found in mammals. For a long time, crows were dismissed as simple background noise in the environment, birds that squawked and scattered and meant nothing beyond the moment. That assumption no longer holds up. The next time one lands on a fence outside your window and sits there watching you for a little longer than seems necessary, it is worth remembering that it may already know considerably more about you than you have ever bothered to learn about it.